So, hello everyone. Welcome to session 10 of the Fantasy Summer School. My name is Adam Kelly. I'm a doctoral researcher here at Oxford, where I work on melancholy and medieval poetry, cheery stuff. It's my pleasure to be chairing this session with two excellent speakers. We'll have time for 5 minutes of questions after the first talk and 15 after the second, so please bear them in mind and we'll try to get to as many of you as possible in that time. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Stuart Lee. He's a professor of English Lit here at Oxford, where he has lectured on Old English, war poetry, Tolkien, and fantasy literature. Stuart's talk today is on gaming and immersive worlds. So welcome, Stuart.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And I will just say at the beginning, I am not a games theorist by any stretch of the imagination, but I was a gamer for many years of my life and misspent youth. So I just want to talk a bit about a combination of games, a bit of history. Gaming, of course, goes back probably one of the earliest things that humankind has tackled or done, a bit like telling fantasy stories. And I'm going to take you through the history of these various components and then try and pull out some similarities to a few things that we have talked about in the past couple of days. So wargaming has been around for many, many years, but people probably focus in on Prussian wargaming, which started in the late 18th century. J. Hellwig's game, which allowed people to sort of simulate battle tactics, etc. The picture on the right is actually from H.G. Wells's Little Wars. He produced a set of rules for wargaming. This is figures in battles, figure battles, etc. Ironically, in 1913, when, of course, a year later, it was all too horrendously real. Commercially produced games, they start to appear very early on. There are boards, as you see there, in the 16th century. But most people talk about after the Second World War in terms of things like Charles Roberts' Tactics or Risk, which appeared, I'm sure we've all played it, in 1959. So let's talk about board games. Now, board games, what I find interesting about them is they are trying to simulate what it's like to be in a particular situation. You, as the player, make decisions, but you're often delivered by chance. And again, you could say, well, that's very like some of what happens to characters in role-playing, and the chance generally is driven by the roll of a dice. You can be everything from a property tycoon, a Monopoly, to solving a murder in Cluedo. But again, I think, as we've said with fantasy books or fantasy stories, they emerge from their time, games emerge from their time. So Monopoly, which actually was first touted around in 1906 and then came out in 1935, really is a game about capitalism and the Great Depression. Cluedo comes out in 1943. It's a game which follows on from the golden age of detective fiction. You're in the locked house trying to solve the murder. And I think also, which I'll come back to in a second, you do experience a sense of immersion, even with something like Monopoly. Oh, what would it be like to own 3 hotels in Mayfair? I'm still in that house trying to solve the murder of Colonel Black or whatever it was. Now, you won't be surprised to know that board games embraced some of the key texts of fantasy literature. There were probably earlier ones than this, but the one that most people point to is 1921. The Oz books, there was a board game for that, which is a very small reproduction there. You'll also come a lot of what they call reskinning, so Risk, the Game of Thrones Risk, or the Lord of the Rings Monopoly. They really aren't the sort of thing we're interested in. We're more interested in a game that attempts to try and take you through the narrative. And because he's my bag, I'm just going to focus or use Tolkien to try and talk about this. Tolkien games actually appear quite early on, 1970, Conquest of the Ring, well, certainly late 60s. There are battle rules for taking your figures round by the ring bearer. The game which probably I remember playing the most was SPI's War of the Ring, which is on a grand scale, a map that is the size of a table, and you try to you either the characters of the Fellowship of Saruman or Sauron. Then we get some really quite classic games coming out, the Kinezia's Lord of the Rings, and probably the one that most people cite, War of the Ring, which is 2000-2004, which again, but you can see the similarity between the SPIs and that one from the War of the Ring. It's dealing with, on a grand scale, Middle-earth, trying to get the ring to Mordor. Okay, role-playing games. And this is where things start to merge, because chainmail, which we often talk about, was about figure battles, but it started to introduce not just muskets and cannons, it started to introduce magic into it. And some of the developers of that in 1973-74 formed Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, which of course most famously leads to Dungeons and Dragons by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And here we get the similarities. So D&D starts that medieval, that fantasy world. Tunnels and Trolls was out at the time, RuneQuest, Warhammer, and so on. But then role-playing starts to embrace other genres, exactly as we've been saying again and again. Bushido was an early one. I remember playing in Japanese culture. Sci-fi came in with Traveller, horror with things like Call of Cthulhu from Chaosium games, etc. Again, like we talk about fantasy, you can play role-playing games at the individual sword and sorcery level. You go in a dungeon, you kill monsters, you take your treasure out the end, or what began to form campaign levels, epic levels, and you can go out to the shops and buy these big packs to take you through these worlds, pre-built worlds and campaign. The dungeon master in a role-playing game is the author. They will world build. They may buy the worlds, but they more often than not will create the world, create their own mythology. With pre-designed scenarios, but they're not necessarily the sole author, as we will come on to, because the narrative can and will diverge because of you, the other players in the game, or non-player characters or whatever. There's still chance involved in it, but so on. Okay. A couple of things we've come up again, influences. So here is Gary Gygax talking about D&D. How did Lord of the Rings influence the D&D game? Whoa, plenty of course. Just about all the players were huge J.R.R. fans, and so they insisted I put as much Tolkien influence material into the game as possible. So again, what we tried to do over the past couple of days is show you that everything, in a way, looks back to what came before. So D&D emerges from this great desire in the 60s to look at, well, the resurgence, in particular in Tolkien and so on. But the second thing I'd say is that we're talking here a role-playing game is about this idea of immersing yourself. You could imagine when you're in reading a book, you can imagine yourself in that other character, what their experience, etc., in a particularly well written. But gaming, of course, affords you the opportunity, as Scott Poole says here, to enter fully into that world, to fully immerse yourself, but also to play out your, and I use it lowercase, fantasy, to be something which you may not be able to be in real life, to explore all of those options. And it's taken new levels, obviously, and some of you may do this, live-action role-playing games. Forget the picture on the right, that's just some people doing it. Picture on the left is probably the more interesting one. That's Peckforton Castle at Cheshire. And in the early 1980s, that was probably the site of the first live-action role-playing in the UK, called Treasure Trap, and I used to go to it, and I can tell you tales about that. Okay, sorry, computer games, that seems to have gone slightly wrong. So just to say again, if we look at Tolkien, we have Moria. So we have early computer games coming out, even in 1975. It's all text-driven, one which I spent an inordinate amount of time when I should have been doing my A-levels playing The Hobbit on the Spectrum. Incredibly frustrating game, but it worked. And then we get things, computer games have moved a lot more. So it changed from that individual playing on a Spectrum in their bedroom to something which became much more multiplayer and so on. And there were a lot of games which developed it. And I just put Demio up there because that came out in 2021. It's not a Lord of the Rings or Tolkien one, but it's a VR game, so you wore a VR headset. And the irony is, the VR headset, when you start playing the game, you are transported to a basement, sitting around a table playing D&D. So you're basically on the set of Stranger Things. So just wrap it up, just a couple of things about theory. So if we look at narrative theory, as some of you may know, there's always a narrative at the core of the board games, and to agree role-playing games, the scenario, if you buy a scenario pack. But of course it's just there, but it will be then destabilized by you, the players. You can challenge it, you can take it, and believe you me, we used to take it in all kinds of directions. And some people have written about this, that In narrative theory, we talk about the fabula, events, actors, time, locations, and then the story is overlaid by the author, and they as the individual control it. But in a game, we perhaps more think about, well, there's a pool of things in there. There are the players, there are the dungeon masters, there's the game system, the rules, and they combine to create the narrative itself. So it's not, we've got bits and pieces, but us sitting around a table or online or whatever are the ones that will change the narrative. A thing that is, though, there is constant tension is trying to keep remaining faithful to the original text. Now that happens, of course, we talked about fan fiction earlier, where people are trying to sort of take the text in new directions or look at some of the opportunities to explore new areas in that. But what we tend to find in the game, certainly in the game rules, is that they are trying to keep faithful to that original narrative. Once we, as players, get hold of it, all bets are off. And then finally, I just want to talk a bit about immersion, losing yourself, and I don't mean in the Jumanji sense where you get sucked into the game physically, but you do get sucked into games. Even with a board game, you will take a side. You may not like it, but you do take a side. If you're playing it, you want to win. That's the objective of it. And I think the other thing which we've touched on again is that, you know, people will receive a text, a fantasy text, in very different ways. I may read it and get something out of it. Someone else may read it and get something completely different out of it. So there's no one type of gamer either. Some people just go in because they love the rules. They love challenging the rules. Other people go in because they just want to have a muck about or whatever. Very different people who will play games. So their experience of a game is very different. But what you will read if you go into this about game theory is things emerge from a bit of psychology about how we immerse ourselves, that there is this intense focus when you are playing a game. And there's discussion of the magic circle, the game's reality starts to dominate you when you are sitting playing either a board game or a role-playing game. And I guess this is, I'm just trying to tie this back to what we talked about already, a bit like Tolkien's secondary belief, because there are times, if you're playing really intensely, particularly at 2 o'clock in the morning, an RPG, you are in that game and you're surrounded by it. And then the other extract here, or comment I made, is Sarah Bowman's 6 Facets of Immersion, where she takes apart, there are all kinds of levels that you can play at. Again, it goes back to the idea that there are gamers who will experience very different things. It might be the character, the setting, the rules itself, which they really get interested in. But then finally, I think when you've played a game, particularly if you've invested a lot of time, there is that bleed. There is that sense you come out of the game, you go into real life, you go back to the mundane, but somehow it can make you see things differently. And it may just be the person you were playing with, and go, oh, they're a backstabber, I'll never trust them again in real life. But it could be at another level, and I suppose that's beginning to touch on Tolkien's recovery. And there's a set of reading if you wish to sort of look on that and explore it a bit further. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much for that, Stuart. That was excellent. Now we've got to speed run some questions. So we've got 5 minutes. Yes, over there.
Thank you for this. This is really fascinating. When I heard games, my first, the first thing that my mind went to was video games, actually, because of course it's where we are. And I just have in mind things that are emerging now. I wonder if it would be a new sort of era to some of what you're saying here with console games, like whole new worlds being built through Elder Scrolls and that sort of thing. And then we're also seeing adaptations like God of War. And of course, part of what's going on there, and this maybe gets a little bit to the experience of the game and what it means for the story world, is the sort of response and engagement with console feedback, with vibrations. We're much more immersive. You mentioned, of course, like headsets and stuff. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so on the second one, we're moving more into that sensory gaming as well. Yeah, with the VR headsets, but also the handheld controls will vibrate, will channel, etc. And you can see where that might head. And I didn't talk about world building as part of the game, which goes way back to those early games like Kingdom and Civilization and so on, but now you would certainly see sort of a lot of young people playing Roblox and so on. You know, they're constantly building new places, or it's pre-built and you go in and you can alter it as well. So yeah, that is something which we see. If you're tying it back to a fantasy world, that still tends to be like Lord of the Rings Online. It's built, but then there are scenarios in there, but they're scenarios which are off the side from the main narrative. They don't let you go in and disrupt what's happening, say, in the Third Age.
Do we have any more in the room? Yeah, just the lady here.
Which lady?
In the cat t-shirt.
Okay.
I think that's a cat.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm wondering if you know, gamers are famous, just like fans who write fan fiction. They're famous for their communities and their community spirit,
Yeah.
particularly those who do, dungeons and more dungeons, the more kind of analog activities. And I'm wondering, we know of quite a few people who became recognized, either self-published or traditionally published authors, coming from fan fiction. I'm wondering, do we know of any similar examples of people coming from this sort of gaming communities who then become recognized, I don't know, screenplay writers or... I don't know.
But I don't know about screenplay, but writers, yes, we do, because we met her yesterday, Samantha Shannon. As she said, I'm a gamer. But going way back, people like Steve Jackson, they were inventing games and game rules and then became authors as well, sometimes of like self-play, role-playing game books and the fighting fantasy books, etc. I don't know, to be honest, but I suspect there are quite a few that at least grew up playing either a board game or a war game or a role-playing game or a video game, and that's sparked them to sort of think that they can create something new.
Excellent. I think
That's
all
probably
we've got
time,
for.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Stuart.
That's
Please
all right, I shall
give him a
now
hand.
get moved.